I'm Aaron Sagers, and this is Talking Strange. Hey there, spooky nerds. Aaron here, and we are back for another episode of Talking Strange, the paranormal pop culture podcast. And today we're going to talk about Paranormal Activity, both the phenomena as well as the movie, because I'm talking to Katie Featherston and Micah Sloat from Paranormal Activity, the 2007 found footage horror film that just became a behemoth. They launched a blockbuster franchise, made a ton of money off of a very meager budget, and just changed the game. It's almost like everybody's got a Paranormal Activity movie story, and I do talk about that in my interview with Katie and Micah. But inspired by the fictional haunting that brought them together, these two friends and former co-stars are now in a new Audible exclusive podcast examining real-life stories of demonic possession, tracing the phenomena from its earliest known accounts to modern-day headlines. And not just demonic possession, but they're talking about ghostly possession, talking about traumatic dark spirits, and then they get into Catholic exorcisms, other kinds of exorcisms, dip into some other lore and different cultures, and even voluntary possession. So the show is Paranormal Activity, True Tales of Possession, and over the course of 10 episodes, with help from noted experts in witchcraft, shamanism, exorcism, parapsychology, Katie and Micah explore these chilling cases throughout history and across culture and folklore, challenging the understanding of the worlds around us. It's a fun show, and it's really well researched. And what's actually really cool about this is I didn't know going into this that Micah Sloat is actually really into this stuff. He's not just an actor that decided to start exploring spirituality and spiritism and the paranormal. He is into it in a very legit way, and that really contributes to the show, as well as Katie's approach, which she is spiritual, but has a little bit more of a, I wouldn't say skepticism, but is asking questions, posing questions. So let's get to it. Let's hear from Micah Sloat and Katie Featherston about their new Audible exclusive show, Paranormal Activity, True Tales of Possession, the podcast. All right, Micah and Katie, Paranormal Activity, True Tales of Possession, only on Audible.
Yes.
I guess my first question for you guys is, after living within the Paranormal Activity universe, as it were, how did the podcast element come about? And also, why did you want to delve into this even further? You know, you can wrap your work on the acting side and then just say goodbye to this whole thing. Why? So how did it come about, and why? Why did you want to do it?
It was actually a long time ago. It was a pandemic project. So we got the call in 2020 when we were all trapped in our houses, and I was in an energy of saying yes. You know, there weren't a lot of things happening in the pandemic. It was a lot of internal quiet time. And so it seemed like a fun thing to work with Micah again, and 4 years later, here we are. So a lot happened in between, but that's the short of it.
Yeah.
I've the long of it. So here we go. So I've been working with the spirit world my whole life. And after the success of Paranormal Activity, I was able to go deep and study with witches and shamans and get a master's degree in transpersonal psychology, which is like getting a master's degree in the paranormal, and really just diving into what is life, what is reality, what are these other realms. And so when Paramount called us and said we want to do a project, it said, well, we don't really know what we want to do. I said, this is what you want to do. And the approach of the podcast, the core essence of it, because there's a lot of ghost shows, a lot of paranormal shows, as you know, you have some. Um, the question is like, why and what is it? And for me, the approach that we're taking is unique. And what I mean by that is that most ghost shows, most paranormal shows come at the paranormal and they say, okay, there's something really weird going on. What is it? Is it, and then you get into the skeptic and the believer argument. So our show is based on this idea that the skeptic and believer argument isn't really necessary if you look at the situation from a different perspective. And that perspective is explained in the first episode when we talk about what the paranormal is and what spirits are. But it basically comes down to this. We experience two worlds: the world of spirit, which is when we dream and when we're asleep and when we imagine and when we have visions, and the world of the physical, where there's science and there's physical objects. But the thing is, we experience the physical world spiritually. Everything we experience is a creation of our mind. And that means I can have a spirit walk into the room and I can see it and I can hear it. I can experience it. It's real to me. It is a real experience, as real as anything else. And yet the camera, like Paranormal Activity, might not see that. They might see something else. So that means we can have very real paranormal experiences and not have them be in conflict with science at all. And from that perspective, then we go on the journey of exploring, what possession is, and talking to witches and shamans and exorcists and all the really cool, guests that we have on the show. So yeah, that's the long of it.
Yeah, I know. Well, I think we're done here. You covered everything.
That's a wrap.
I want to note on this that as far as you having an interest in this, and I actually I wasn't aware of this until I was prepping for this interview, that you were deeply invested in this, and the studying Peruvian shamanism, British traditional witchcraft, Hawaiian shamanism, which I happen to love quite a bit. I love Hawaiian folklore, and transpersonal psychology. And so as far as that goes, this wasn't an actor that did a movie and then was like, you know what? I got a good gimmick going here. I'm gonna keep with this. I'm gonna keep it. You came from this from an interest before, and then the massive hit, and that kind of allowed you to kind of fund the additional studies and whatnot.
Exactly. And actually, it comes all the way back to me as a kid, engaging with and talking to spirits, working like in some really gnarly ways, quite honestly, that were very difficult, because I didn't have any guidance. And as an adult, when I was able to connect to like Griffin, my witchcraft teacher, who's on two of the episodes, like he was able to explain, oh, you're not crazy. You're just a wit. You have the sight. You have the ability to work with spirits. And this is how you do it. And how all of a sudden it was like, oh my God, thank God that I have some training and some guidance and I don't have to figure it all out myself, because I was making all of the mistakes that you can avoid if you have proper training. So, and actually, what I'm doing with the launch of the podcast, now that I've mentioned it, is I'm launching. For years, I've had this private business, referral business. It's like I call Spirit Work, and we work with people. And what it is it's essentially working with the story of your own life, and because you're the main character, like you're the main character in the movie of your own life. And how do you become the author? How do you take charge of the narrative? How do you change the story if you want to change it? And that actually is the practice of witchcraft and shamanism. So it's what I did was I took the magic and the psychology and combined it so that it's accessible and immediate. And I'm opening it up to the world with the launch of the podcast. So micahsloat.com, Spirit Work is available if you're interested.
All right. And then, so there's the Mika of it all, and then Katie. So, you're making this movie, you're making this podcast now. I would not describe the dynamic, even though it's like the easiest way to describe it. I would not describe the dynamic on the podcast as Mulder Scully, because it's not that. It's not believer skeptic.
No.
It feels more like an exchange of questions and conversations. It feels very like this back and forth flow. But talk about your approach, kind of how you see your role in the podcast, but also, what you're thinking as your friend and co-star is talking about this stuff.
Yeah, what was important to me at the beginning of this project was that if I was going to do it, I needed to be able to be as true to myself as possible. And so for me, that is like, I'm a very spiritual person. I have always been. I have like deep intuition. Griffin would call it the sight. It's like have different terminology for similar things. But I've always been very spiritual, very intuitive. I've never had an interest necessarily in the scarier aspects of the paranormal. Like I would say I'm interested in spirituality. I'm interested in what happened, what are the things we can't see, the things we can't necessarily tangibly explain, but not from a scary lens. However, having said that, I love to be scared. I love scary movies. That's fun for me, but I'm not invested in it in the same way that Micah is. So for me, my role in this podcast is how can I be kind of a voice of the audience? How can I ask? Because Micah has a lot of knowledge and exploration in this world that I would guess many of the listeners don't. I certainly don't. So how can I be a voice for the audience? How can I ask questions that maybe come up for me or I think might come up for an audience member and sort of facilitate the podcast in that way? Because I don't have that same background. I see the world through a very spiritual lens, through a lens of psychology, but not necessarily through the exact same lens as Micah. So it's, I think, beneficial for the podcast to have two kind of perspectives that don't necessarily, they may be different in moments, but they don't necessarily clash. It just allows room for conversation. If I never asked Micah a question, then where would the conversation go? Like we need to have that back and forth. And we're, at the end of the day, like anytime Warren Pelly or Micah Sloat ever call me up and say, hey, do you want to do something? Like there's never going to be a day where I'm like, absolutely not even going to consider it and hang up. I love Warren. I love Micah. We are a team for life. So any chance to work with either of them is always a win in my book.
And you really do cover a lot of ground with the podcast as far as, I mean, just even structurally, format wise, there's the back and forth between you. There's the produced kind of story, the reenactment, audio reenactment of it, and then the interview segment. You're bringing in, different shamans and exorcists throughout the 10 episodes. The staying, well, okay, I guess I'm curious about the vulnerability involved in this because Micah, I don't think most people are aware of some of your experiences. I mean, you even say at the top of the first episode that I've been possessed. You talk about that, and you've talked about some other experiences there. So there's that vulnerability, and then the vulnerability of Katie being involved in this project, but it's also being involved in sort of the woo woo of it all. So did you feel a little vulnerable while working on this project? Why don't you start, Katie, and then Micah, why don't you pick that up?
I think there's a vulnerability anytime, I'll speak for myself. I think I feel vulnerable anytime I am, even in this podcast right now, like I don't know what will come out. I don't have any control over the final product. I only have control over my part in it, right? So there's always a vulnerability in putting yourself out there and not being the one who's in charge of the final result. So there was a vulnerability in that for sure. But I have an acceptance and a space for all perspectives and for each person's individual cosmology with the world. And I don't have a attachment to anyone seeing things exactly the way I do or vice versa. I don't need to see things exactly the way you do or Micah does or one of our guests do. I'm kind of inherently in my soul a bit of a mediator. Like I inherently sort of see everybody's, it's probably a divorced kid thing, but I like see everybody's space and I try to like find this kind of common ground in between. So I think whether that comes through on the podcast or not, that's definitely kind of where I think I'm rooted. And I'm comfortable in that. So there was for sure, I don't care about woo-woo stuff. Like, cool. Like I'm into woo-woo stuff. I may not see it the exact same way as someone else, but this is a magical world that we live in, full of spirituality and intuition and things to explore. There is a time when people looked at the stars and thought they were gods. I mean, like we all like, and now we know they're stars, and who's to say they're not also gods? Like there's things to be explored, and to for anyone to say, well, this is the only answer is, I think, short-sighted. So I don't mind exploring, and if it's vulnerable, that makes it better.
I mean, it's funny, even though, we're, I guess, was it like 15 years, about 15 years since the theatrical release of Paranormal Activity, the wide release. It obviously it hit big then and tapped into a fascination with this material. Is also at the height of, paranormal reality TV shows, and then things kind of went away for a bit. But I actually think that post-pandemic or whatever,
Hmm.
the paradigm has shifted a bit, and people are fascinated with this stuff all over again in a whole new way, sort of like the return to spiritualism, like a postmodern spiritualism, but with this expanded idea of what's out there, not just heaven, hell, good, bad, God and devil, but sort of the nuances, the spectrum of woo, if you will. um, and Mika, yeah.
Well, oh man, there's so much stuff. What's great about working with Katie, she comes up with these great things that then I get to elaborate on go deep. Like it's awesome. So a couple of things that she said that were really important and also thread with what you're talking about. The first thing is the idea that we're all storytellers and that we all have the divine right to tell whatever story about reality that we want, and that includes the physical world and the spiritual world. So like we can tell, you can be a believer and think everything was created by a God, or be really religious. You can be an atheist and you can just ignore spirituality and just have everything be scientific. And there's no sort of, there isn't one right story for everybody. There's just our own storytelling process, and whether or not your story works. Does it bring you into love and compassion and harmony, and does it make your life better, or does it bring you to hate and dysfunction? So we all have a responsibility to tell the best story that we can for ourselves and for other people. So that when we're talking on the podcast about all this paranormal stuff, we're really exploring the possibilities, exploring the spirit world with ourselves and with each other, with these great teachers, so that we can evolve and our understanding and our stories, so we can get closer and closer and closer to the truth that we can never really nail down. We can just get better at storytelling. So that's the first thing. Then the second thing, you were talking about vulnerability. There was a tremendous amount of vulnerability for me in the show, because I'm sharing all kinds of stuff I never shared anybody. But it goes back to the storytelling thing, because we are storytellers, and by sharing our story and being vulnerable, we can then listen to each other and learn and grow and say, oh, maybe I'm not alone. Maybe there's other people experiencing what I'm experiencing. And that's very important and healing. And so that's why I do it. That's why I'm vulnerable about all this stuff. And then another thing that we're brought up is this idea of like the other realms, the shadow world. Like why do people listen to horror? Why do the show at all? And there's something about the darkness that exploring that, not just clinging to the light and trying to ignore the shadow, but by going into it and confronting it and looking at what it can do. And saying, okay, well, I understand this, so it won't own me. It doesn't dominate me. I'm not going to let my fear and my pain run my life. I'm going to approach it and look at it and work with it so that I can master it and become integrated into my life and become a whole person. So that's why I think exploring the shadow has extreme value. And I know I just put it like there was just like all this different topics in a row, but it's because Katie brings up a lot of great stuff in me, so that you can see a little bit of the podcast here.
I mean, there's also the notion of you stare into the abyss long enough, it starts to stare back. If you start poking around in the shadows, maybe something starts to take notice. I mean, is there any kind of like either legitimate concern of like, all right, this is actually a little bit creepy. Maybe I'm opening myself up to anything, or yeah, or even just making you suddenly see, that pile of clothes on the chair in your bedroom at night suddenly starts to look like a form, you know?
Right.
Uh,
Well,
Katie, you look like you.
I'll jump in on that. I think that goes back to what story are you telling? So for me, no, there's
Yeah.
no pile of clothes is ever going to look like anything but a pile of clothes because I choose to stay in this beautiful world. I confront shadow from a more psychological lens, so my story is that no, there's nothing scary here. There's nothing I'm going to tap into that I'm going to tap into too much. I can step in, explore, and then close that door right on back up because I have the absolute power to do that. So
Yeah.
that's the story that I tell, is that I have that absolute power to flip the light back on when I'm done. And,
Hmm.
you know, so if I told a different story, maybe it would be a different experience internally for me. I don't know.
Yeah. And you bring up a really good point, and Katie had a really good answer to it because it illustrates the power of our own storytelling to determine a reality. Like, what reality are you living in? If you're living in a reality with demons in it, and that they might be haunting you, then you're going to create that for yourself, and you're going to start to perceive things through that lens. And it's very important to protect yourself accordingly. So when we're doing the show, for me at least, especially when we're interacting with all of these old stories that have a lot of power in them, and we're talking about demons and stuff, for me it's very important to go in with a protective lens. Like, how do I keep myself safe in this environment? How do I also help keep the show and the audience safe? We're not trying to curse the audience by exposing them to dark things that then they are, like, involved with. It's trying to empower the audience and everyone who's listening and involved in order to get a better grasp of the stories that we're telling, of the stories we're living inside of, so that if there is something that comes up that's scary, you can do something about it. You're not a victim.
Hmm. Yeah, and plus, like, cursing your audience is just really bad for retention.
It's
And
not super entertaining,
it's like scare them, but don't curse them.
Yes,
Like,
exactly.
fine line.
although
Yeah.
I don't know how the podcast ratings go as far as this goes, but if your audience member is possessed, does that count as two listens? I don't. But
Well,
uh, let's
yeah.
let's talk a little bit about some of the topics you get into here, because the you do cover a lot of ground. Even though the it's right there in the title, True Tales of Possession, it's not all scary demon Beelzebub, and Pazuzu. You're covering lots of ground. So walk us through some of the topics, and also, if you had a kind of a stake in selecting these different topics, I'd be curious to hear that as well. Whoever wants to take that.
Uh, so
Me.
I set it up, so I should take this one. My thought process when creating the episodes was to take the audience through a series of topics that build on each other. So, for example, the first episode is just purely, what is a spirit, what is possession, what is the paranormal. Like, let's get some framework to understand what we're talking about here, so we have a shared language, so that the audience doesn't need to agree with me, but at least that we've put out our perspective, that we have, so that you guys know what we're talking about.
Sort of
And then,
like the show Bible, right up
right,
the top,
show Bible at the top. And then the next couple episodes are what kind of spirits might possess somebody. We talk about ancestor spirits, we talk about ghosts, we talk about demons, we talk about shadow spawn, the demons from the personal unconscious. And we're doing this all in the different context of these stories that reflect those particular spirits. So, like, this is a ghost story, this is a demon haunting, and so forth. And then once we establish what kind of spirits possess people, we can talk about what to do when you want to get rid of them. And then we get into exorcism, and Catholic exorcism specifically, where we have the foremost exorcist for the Catholic Church on. And then once we talked about that, we sort of like, that's like the greatest hits of possession. We start to go into other things that people might not know about, things like voluntary possession, using spirit voluntary possession to heal. And in fact, when I talk about being possessed at the top of the episode, that's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about involuntary possession like you see in like a demon possession movie. I'm talking about intentionally calling in spirits for power, for reasons of healing and power, and so forth. We get into what is trauma? How does trauma create demons for people? And like addiction, what happened? How do you get in there and heal it? How are these shamans healing that, and what does it look like? So that we get into at the end. And Katie, did I miss anything?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I'll add to that. What I do like about it is that even though I was raised Catholic, and the Catholic exorcism is definitely like the rock star, top of the marquee as far as like horror exorcisms, but you do dip into like a Jewish faith, the Dybbuk and
Right.
other kind of types of exorcisms. So you do cover a lot of ground there.
Yeah.
Is
Yeah.
there is there a story out of this batch, especially, that even from a psychological standpoint, and this would be, Katie, even from a psychological standpoint, just sort of gets under your skin, even if you're just like, okay, yeah, maybe there is a reason for this or maybe a reason for that, but it's still unnerving enough that it sits with you a little bit.
Um, I mean, a lot of the stories were kind of get under your skin in different ways. I remember it might be the first episode, but the one where the young girl shows up and she's, speaking in the voice of a different young lady, and that idea that someone you lost could the spirit of that person could show up in another person is, and know things and that kind of stuff is always um because I'm certainly not one to I have certainly in my own like heart internally had moments where I was like, oh, someone just kind of reminded me that they still exist in the spirit world, whether it's my grandmother or someone who's passed. It's just a moment where I just can very viscerally feel, or a song will play or something will happen, and someone might say I'm writing a story around that, and it has nothing, to do with that person. Someone else, like myself, might say, yeah, I'm writing a story around this moment, meaning that this energy, this spirit has chosen to connect with me in this moment. So that's how I experience it in my life. But wouldn't it be both kind of terrifying but also fascinating if it happened in a much more visceral way in another person? So I think that story kind of
Yeah.
sticks with
The
me for sure.
Yeah, the Watsika Wonder is a story I was familiar with already out of the late 19th century. I actually haven't really heard about it, talked about on any other podcast. So it was kind of nice to introduce this to other folks. It also according to the story that this young girl is possessed by another spirit for 15 weeks. 15 weeks of a spirit inhabiting her body, which is either you wonder about, like, well, where does the prime spirit go? Is it just kind of hanging out in the background? Does it go to Fiji, or what? Like, do you get a vacation from yourself? Because that sometimes that is somewhat appealing to be able to just like check out, for a bit of time. But it's a great story, and I was really thrilled that you started with that historical bit. Mika, was there any story that kind of got under your skin more than others? And then if you want to add to what Katie said as well.
Definitely. Well, just to speak to what you were just talking about, the being possessed for a really long period of time. In my view, the best actors are the ones who are doing voluntary possession work. If you want to see what this is like, you can watch the movie Jim and Andy about Jim Carrey and playing Andy Kaufman, where he
Right.
essentially does a voluntary possession of Andy Kaufman, and Andy Kaufman's own family is like, this is Andy. And he did the whole movie like that. So I imagine it would be very similar with the Watsika Wonder. As far as the story that bothered me the most, I do a lot of work with people's really trauma and really dark things, and it's always terrible to encounter the darkness on some level because it's terrifying. That's what it is. But at the same time, you can get comfortable with the uncomfortable and learn how to deal with it and work with it and have compassion. So you understand, okay, well, this scary thing isn't necessarily scary at its root. It's just scary because it hasn't been listened to for a long time or needs some love or something. So that's one perspective. But what's the worst and most terrifying and most fucked up thing that we experienced in the whole series for me was when the exorcists failed to do their job and
Oh
killed
yeah.
Annalise Michelle after
Annalise Michelle.
I think I blocked that one out.
67
That was very
exorcisms, 67 exorcisms, and basically murdered this girl through the Catholic rite of exorcism. What's scary and horrible about that is it's such a violation of trust. It's such a violation. This girl's life was in their hands, and they did the opposite of what they were supposed to do. That makes me very angry. That was the most disturbing thing for me.
Hmm. Yeah, and you know, personally, like it's a for me, it's like a case of even though I think there's a lot of strange things going on out there, it's a case of how like how religion belief can be a form of abuse, you know?
Yeah,
um,
exactly. Well said. Yeah, especially when you have the belief that it's like it's one thing to do an exorcism and then be like, okay, we got to do another one. But at some point, when you're doing 67, we would think you would say, okay, this isn't working. Let's try something else. And what's so necessary is to go with what works, not with what you believe is the right thing, and just keep
mhm.
doubling down on the wrong thing is a kind of ideological blindness. And it's that ideological blindness that's so painful. And I think we can see that in society all over the place.
So I know you guys travel around to Comic Cons, and it's clear that there is a true friendship between you two. I was I was curious if you could kind of explain a bit of that friendship, the dynamics between you two, and how this podcast, this project in particular, may have deepened or evolved that friendship. Because as a listener, I could be way off, but as a listener, to me, I hear in Katie's voice like this very protective element of Micah, you know, and I could be wrong, but I would like you to tell me, give me like help me understand your relationship and that friendship and how this project has evolved that friendship. Katie, why don't you start?
well. I think one thing that comes up for me is we made the movie when we were in our whatever early mid 20s, something like early 20s, and we are no longer in our 20s. So we've been friends for a really long time. So you're hearing us be you know, you're hearing us in a podcast be more ourselves for sure than we were in the movie, because in the movie we were acting and we had known each other for a matter of weeks, and now we've known each other for years and years. So you're getting a different version of us, and in that way we are ourselves here. um and I think that I think sometimes things are sort of kismetly meant to be. Like when Mika and I met in the callback, we hit the ground running and never really looked back. And he's the kind of, I might cry. He's the kind of, he lives down the street. Like we'll go months without talking to each other, and then we'll just meet up for a convention or to get a meal somewhere or whatever, a holiday party. And it's like no time has passed. You have those people in your life where you are connected. We've had this like life-changing experience together, like transformative life-changing experience of that first movie, where our lives were one way, the movie came out and our lives were totally different. And not only the making of the movie, but the experience of the movie coming out, I think has bonded us in a way that only the two of us will know what that experience was like. And when we're like super old and really gray, even if it's been like 4 years or 5 years since I've talked to him, like when we see each other, it's going to be just like it is right now. Like that's just who we are, I think.
Well
Yeah.
said.
Yeah, I am protective of him. I'll go to bat for him. Let's go.
Hey, no, I don't want to
And
interrupt.
he would go to bat for me, and that's the thing, you know. Yeah.
I think there's a certain magic, like say Katie said, the kismet. There, like when we met at the callback, uh, basically it was like Oren said, "Mika, this is Katie. Katie, this is Mika. Tell me how you met." And we just went into the backstory for Paranormal Activity
Made it up.
instantly, and it was amazing. And this like magic happened. And I think there's a great, how should I put this? Uh, Richard Rohr, the Catholic priest, talks about the concept of grace. And there's like this magic in the universe where that brings things that are like beyond these blessings that are sort of beyond like anything, almost beyond karma. It's not like you did anything to do, like it's like karma is a part of it because you have to be a good person to accept grace and so forth. But like there's an energy of grace that is just this magic that is somehow bestowed on us. And in my view, this knowing Katie and all this stuff that we've been done together and continue to do is just a massive amount of blessing and grace, not only with Katie, with the audience, with the it's what's so beautiful about Paranormal Activity is that because of the Demand It campaign, we had literally 1 million+ people like listed in the credits. We created this together with you guys, with the listeners. The listeners asked for more for the podcast. Like the fans of the film wanted more. That's where the podcast comes from. And this is an ongoing exploration of spirituality with the listeners, with Katie, and in my view, there's a service element. You know, whether it's with the spirit work that I do with the podcast, it's being in service of the forces of the universe that blessed us with all this grace so that we can continue to bring light, to help share important stories, to connect people with great teachers. Like, how do we tell better stories and lift up ourselves and each other and the world? Like, that's really, to me, the responsibility that comes with the grace.
I won't keep you too much longer. I want to ask just a couple final questions, but one of them is, you know, the Paranormal Activity is one of these films that people have the memory of the film, but equally it made such an impact that people remember like when they first saw it or the scenario involving it. I mean, for me, I was working at a newsroom. I was just more of a journalist at that time, and I was kind of moving slowly into the paranormal TV side of things. It was starting to pick up, and it was before the wide release, a unmarked DVD with the film and nothing on it, nothing on the sleeve, and it was with the original ending. I think it was it was during the festival, doing the festival circuit. So that's like it's a great story. It's like this thing that I remember about like being thrust into this world, and it's something I will remember. And I was just curious, anecdotally, throughout these events, throughout the fan interactions, what has been like a notable experience that someone has shared with you about seeing the movie, that if you can recall one? Katie, if you want to begin on that one.
Um, I actually we went to I mean, I've had quite a few I've heard of quite a few stories that have stuck with me, but I heard one at this most recent convention that we went to that like was so moving. A woman was not even supposed to be at that convention. She came to get a piece of artwork for a friend, and so she like beelined in, bought the artwork, and was leaving, and I looked over and saw me at the table, and she was like, "Oh my gosh!" And she had to come over and say hi. And she shared with me that her mother had been diagnosed. I'm going to say this quickly so I can get through it all. But her mother had been diagnosed with cancer in, I think, 2019, and to kind of escape from the difficulties of going through treatment, she would play the first couple of paranormal movies like on loop for 48 hours. I mean, just constantly they were on. And she would talk about the films, she would get really into them. And the daughter liked the movies fine, but the mom loved them. And so they would play all the time, all the time. And so now that this woman's mom has passed, sometimes she will put on the paranormal movies and there'll be like a comfort for her, and they will allow her to feel connected to her mom because they played so often when her mom was struggling, and they were a bit of relief for her mom. So she plays them now to feel closer to her mom who has passed. So by the end of her telling me the story, we're like hugging and crying at the table, and it was really a beautiful story to hear and really vulnerable for her to share. But I was really grateful that she did.
Oh, that's very sweet, very poignant.
Yeah.
No pressure, Mika, but that's a good story.
I'm going to have a totally different one, but it actually it describes the difference between Katie and I, because Katie really fields the poignant emotional moments, and then I'm like, tell me the scary shit.
Tell me a scary story about it.
Yeah, what happened to you? Oh my God. So let's see. Well, first I'll just say that what's been happening recently at conventions is there's been a shift between like when we used to go to conventions and talk, everybody had most of the people had demanded it, or there was this part of that initial groundswell. And then what we're seeing now is a lot of people who say, I saw Paranormal Activity when I was like 12 or 13, and that opened the door to me being a horror fan. And that's like we were at recently a Midsummer Scream in Long Beach, and I heard that probably 100 times. Is this new generation being introduced to the movie and loving it, and it opening up something for them, which is proof to me that what we're doing is it's beyond just making a movie. There's something going on here, and I was thinking about what that is, and I think what it is that Paranormal Activity, because it involves the audience and the audience imagination so deeply, because otherwise there's not much going on. There's like the sheets moving and stuff, but your brain is doing all of the lifting. And in doing that, we are helping open the door to the spirit world on some level. Like people start to feel like, what's going on there? What's in the shadows? What is this other realm about? And then the fascination is so natural because we want to know about these other things. We want to know about this world. And the podcast is a continuation of that.
Mm-hmm.
And to answer your question about stories, I've heard so many over the years, but one of my favorite ones is someone watched the film and got so terrified they had to leave their house, and they slept in their car, and then they were so terrified and there were so many noises and like they were bugging out, they put a circle of salt around their car, and they were doing all these magical rituals to protect themselves from it. Because once you open up the door to the spirit world, what happens is your mind can play, and your story about reality and the reality you're living in becomes richer. And all of a sudden you might have spirits there that weren't there before, and it becomes necessary then to deal with them, just like we were talking about in the beginning. How do you protect yourself? So we're not, by the way, when you watch Paranormal Activity and the other movies, like we're not cursing you. We're not saying that you are going to be haunted by demons, but by opening the door to the possibility, your stories start to come alive, and that's an opportunity to play with them and to protect yourself and to gain spiritual power. So good luck.
I have a bit of a comedic relief to share very quickly, and that is when I started dating my husband, he had two really close guy friends from college. And one day after an alcoholic beverage, they confessed to me that when they first saw Paranormal Activity, the two of them had to sleep in the same room because they were too terrified they were roommates. They were too terrified to sleep in their separate bedrooms. And they were like, we have to tell you this now, Katie, because we don't know how to be friends with you if we don't share this embarrassing fact. And I was like, I've heard it before, guys, but I love to hear it now. So I like to tease them about that.
It's to live with you.
Well, I mean, and picking up on Mika's opening the door comment, Katie, in the background, you have this door, and I'm like, if she doesn't already have this rigged to open up just slightly during an interview, you should really. It's like Chekhov's gun, It's just.
I should have. I have two dogs that are out there. And a cat. I have two dogs and two cats, and if I opened it a little, it would have opened all the way, and you wouldn't have seen them. They would have crawled in. Yeah.
It just finally, if I may, I always like to ask people, especially people that are in the business of having made scares or telling scary stories, about their childhood urban legend, their boogeyman, the creepy old house at the end of the block, or something that they kind of grew up with that still exists within them? Do you, Katie, I knew you grew up in Texas.
I did.
Any boogeyman, any urban legend or creepy story that you lived with?
Not Texas related, but Candyman was the scariest movie for me growing up, and my best friend and I, to this day, remain very scared of it. So scared, in fact. I mean, I'm not scared of Tony Todd. I think I'm just kind of like a little. I have a lot. It's like some. I'm a fan, so I think I'm a little starstruck. But I have. He's been at conventions, and I've never said hi, because I just am like, I can't. It's Tony Todd. It's so cool.
I,
But Candyman was for sure the scariest growing up.
I I do a lot of the Comic Cons as well, and there was one a handful of years ago that there's like the interaction on the floor, the niceties in the green room where it's like, oh hey, Tony, like, wow, it was really cool, Tony Todd. But the weirdest one was just some random evening I'm going to a bar just to kind of like in this casino where the event was, just to decompress for a minute and kind of
Hmm.
separate yourself from everything, and you're in your own world because you're around people all the time or all day, right? You're in your own world just trying to have your moment. And I hear that voice, that Tony Todd voice right next to me. And I don't even know exactly what he said, but it was something convention related, like, like you're trying to get away too, or something like, I can't do
Oh
Tony's
God.
voice. But that both like kind of startled me, but also filled me with glee. And it just like the out of
Yeah,
context moment that would
yeah.
just made such a mark on me.
I
So
love it. I've
he's incredible.
I never go into a parking garage where for a split second I don't picture him at the end of the parking garage, and I'm just like, okay, we're good. He's not there. He's not there. I'm gonna make it. I'm gonna get to my car safely. Yeah.
We've been at many
Uh,
conventions with Tony Todd, and I'm always like, Katie, go say hi. And she's like, I'm so scared, but I also
My
want to talk to him.
my best friend had him do a cameo for me for my 30th birthday, I think. So I have a cameo from him, but I've never said hi.
that is
You know,
awesome. I love
once a
it.
fan, always a fan.
Oh, he's great. Mika, just do you have any urban legend from your childhood? Any kind of personal boogeyman?
I have been living with spirits of all kinds my whole life, and I would to answer that question in any amount of detail would take an hour at least. But I will just say, as I've met spirits of like very of great power, demon, all kinds of spirits, um, and I will say when dealing with the dark things, the more knowledge you have, the better. Because if you understand how these energies work and what they're about, what they want, and most importantly, how to protect yourself and keep yourself safe, you can work with the darkness and have it be a working partner. Even the quite or the really horrible stuff, it's one of the things that actually one of our guests on the exorcism episode explained. I don't know if he did. It might have been a personal teaching because he's a teacher and of mine. Can't remember if we talked about this on the episode, but we were talking about demons and why they're evil. And he pointed out that demons are spirits of chaos, and they fuck shit up. They break the established order. And what that does is it creates an extraordinary amount of pain to shake things up like that. And the pain is perceived by humanity as evil. So we see these beings as evil because they cause pain. But if you look at them from sort of an amoral lens, they're really just chaotic energy. And because the universe is in a primordial dance between order and chaos always, knowing how to work with the chaos is important. And if you want change, you need chaos. You need to break up the established order so you can create a new one. So understanding how to work with the darkness, even demons, even the devil, can become not something evil, but something that is simply a power that you can use in whatever way you choose. And that's really gets into what witchcraft is and why witches would work with the devil or demons or something like that. But just to know that it's not, generally speaking, it's not coming from a desire to hurt or desire to create evil. It's a desire to create change.
Mhm.
So I mean, not exactly the answer that you may be looking for, but there you go.
Okay. I mean, I think the takeaway from that as well is that Katie should really befriend Tony Todd. And, since he's played such a memorable monster, work with him.
That's
Work
right.
with him and own the
Face my fear.
side. Yes,
Yep.
exactly.
Yep.
Well, guys, I really appreciate your time. Paranormal Activity, True Tales of Possession. It's 10 episodes out right now. I hope we'll be getting some more. I mean, is there any plans in the work that you can speak of?
I mean, we just released this one. Haven't heard anything yet, but who knows? Hopefully, we'll do some more.
All right.
I would love to. There's great ideas in the works. Let's do this, Paramount.
The spirits are willing. All right, guys, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, I hope we get a chance to speak again in the future.
Looking forward to it.
And that was Katie Featherston and Micah Sloat from Paranormal Activity, the film, and from the new Audible exclusive podcast, Paranormal Activity, True Tales of Possession. And all 10 episodes are available now only at Audible. So do check that out. I think it's really nicely put together. It's really great production value. And we have both the conversation between Katie and Micah, as well as we have some reenactments, and they're telling the story and then bringing in those expert interviews. But I like actually listening to them talk to one another. So it's a solid podcast. And based on that interview, I also just liked hearing them talk about the experience of doing Paranormal Activity and people coming up to them and sharing their stories of having watched it, and Katie's both admiration and maybe being starstruck and a little bit afraid of Tony Todd. I love that. It's very relatable. Anyhow, I'm Aaron Sagers. This has been another Talking Strange. Until next time, be kind, stay spooky, and keep it weird.